Hello, and welcome to Samuel's Fortress. I'm your host Kirill, and today we will be discussing the Slavic invasion of Macedonia. Before we jump back into the timeline and pick up where we left off in the previous video, I do want to give you a bit of a background on the Slavic peoples. Who they were, where they came from, what their customs were like, and so forth. So, who are the Slavs? Like the other barbarian tribes we discussed, such as the Goths, the Slavs come from north of the Danube. Now, because the Slavs did not have a written record, they were not a literate people, it's hard to pinpoint a lot of details about them with any specificity. However, based on archaeological evidence and Roman historical records, we believe that the Slavs originated in modern-day Ukraine. So you can think of Ukraine as kind of the homeland of the Slavic peoples. And the Slavs at this time are not unified in any sense. They do have a common culture, they speak the same language, they look the same. That's all unified in that sense. However, when we talk about political structures, the Slavs are by no means a unified people. They live in a tribal system. So they have these local tribes, which are essentially based on kind of extended families. They'll form a tribal structure, which is actually quite democratic. The Romans note how these Slavs are a very democratic people. They don't have any real sophisticated forms of hierarchy. They do have like a tribal chief, like an elder Slavic patriarch, so to speak, but this is more nominal. The basic structure is democratic in their societies. And these Slavic tribes, they war with one another, they compete with one another, they have these internal conflicts. So again, they're not unified politically, they are based on this kind of localized tribal structure. As far as their customs, their religion goes, stuff like that, again, it's very hard to tell. Not much is known on that front. We know that the Slavs were pagans. That is certainly the case. Like other pagans, they had a deity, a main deity, and they also had like a pantheon of other deities and gods. But the main Slavic deity was known as Perun. Perun is the god of thunder. You can think of him, if you want to kind of compare to other pagan structures, you can think of him as the equivalent of Zeus in the Greek mythology, or Odin, for example, in the Nordic mythologies. So this is the main Slavic deity. You have some lesser minor gods, such as Veles. Veles is the god of the underworld, and actually the modern Macedonian city of Veles is named after this deity. Vesna is another deity. This is the Slavic goddess of fertility and springtime, and Vesna is actually a pretty common name in Macedonia today. So even though obviously the pagan religion died off a long time ago, some of the remnants of that culture still remain today, at least in terms of names of cities and of people. So that's kind of what the Slavs' political structure, tribal structure was like, what their religion was like. Not much is known. That's kind of all we really know about it. I will actually quote here from John Fine's book, The Early Medieval Balkans, which is an excellent source on the early medieval Balkans, but particularly regarding the Slavic invasions into the Balkans. And I'll be referencing this work pretty heavily throughout this video and the next video regarding the Slavic invasions in Macedonia. But for now, I'm going to quote from John Fine's work here, where he makes reference to Procopius, who is a Roman historian and a lawyer, and he will discuss Procopius's account of the Slavs. So, quoting now, quote, Procopius says that the Slavs lived in poor huts, spread far apart, and they moved frequently. Either they were pastoral or they were primitive farmers who quickly exhausted the soil and had to move on. They tended to war on foot with spears and bows and arrows. Other than shields, they had no armor. They did not keep captives along in slavery. They tried to ransom them quickly and send them home. Those who were not ransomed were soon allowed to live freely within the society like everyone else. The Slavs had much endurance. They had poor food, but they were very hospitable. They avenged the injuries to their guests. They lived in or near woods, swamps, and along rivers. They generally had secret exits for escape routes and hid their valuables. When fleeing, they often hid underwater, breathing through straws. In battle, they stressed guerrilla tactics and specialized in hit-and-run ambushes. The Byzantine strategists felt it was best to attack them in the winter when their tracks could be seen in the snow, when it was easy to cross frozen rivers, and when their stock was at home. So, if we take this Roman account of the Slavs at face value, we can see that these are pretty kind of primitive tribal peoples. When I read that, in my head, I imagined kind of the accounts of the Native American tribes here in North America, as far as being nomadic, living in huts, using guerrilla tactics, hit and run tactics, and so forth. So you can kind of think of them in that fashion, and that kind of gives you a general idea of who the Slavs were and what they were like. Now, getting back into the timeline, like I said previously, we left off in the last video with the Romans expelling the Goths from their Balkan territories and establishing fortifications along the Danube to prevent further barbarian raids into Roman territory. That was roughly around the early 6th century that we left off in the previous video. Now, in the middle of the 6th century, around 550 AD, we see Slavic raids coming into the Balkans. Now, why these Roman fortifications didn't work is because even though they were built there, like we said in the previous video, the Balkans is heavily depopulated. The previous Gothic raids devastated the Balkans, and we see a significant drop in population as people flee the area, go up into the mountains, and so forth. So even though the fortifications exist, they're not well defended, and the Slavs managed to break through the fortifications and start raiding the Balkans in a similar fashion to the Goths. Similar to the Goths, they utilize the Roman highway structure, and they raid the towns, villages, cities along these Roman highways. Again, like with the Goths, they are killing, raping, plundering, taking slaves, this typical barbarian behavior in the Roman territories. Where the Slavs differ from the Goths is in the fact that the Slavs actually end up settling the Balkans, as opposed to where the Goths would raid the Balkans, take slaves, take valuables, and then retreat back across the Danube to their homelands and do this, annually on a regular basis. The Slavs brought their families with them. The Slavic warriors, the Slavic raiders brought their families with them and settled the territory. They didn't leave and go back across the Danube. The reason why they didn't do this is because, as I just read from the account by Procopius, the Slavs were a kind of primitive farming peoples. They were a kind of pastoral people. And when they raided the Balkans, they found deserted farmlands. When the Roman farmers fled to the mountains due to the Gothic raids, they left these pretty fertile rural farmlands abandoned, and the Slavs arrived and utilized that farmland. They took advantage of the fact that no one was there farming it, so they settled it. So as these Slavic raids continue to occur throughout the 6th century, they start bringing more and more women, children with them, and start settling the Balkans pretty heavily, until the point where there are pretty significant Slavic settlements in the Balkans, in Macedonia, by the end of the 6th century. Now, you might be wondering why the Romans, why the Byzantines, and again, I'll be using those terms interchangeably, Roman, Byzantine. Byzantine is simply a modern term to make reference to this Eastern Christian empire after the fall of the West. The Roman Empire based out of Constantinople is referred to by modern historians as the Byzantine Empire, but at the time, they're simply Romans. They think of themselves as Romans. So Byzantine, Roman, these are the same thing. I'll be using those terms pretty interchangeably, but nevertheless, you might be wondering why the Byzantines aren't doing anything about these massive Slavic raids and settlements into their Balkan territories. Well, it's because the Byzantines are preoccupied on their eastern front with the Persians. The Persians, who are a much more formidable and much more well-organized military force, are invading parts of the Eastern Empire in Asia, in the Near East, and so forth. So the Byzantines simply don't have the men or the resources or the time to deal with these Slavs. The Persian threat is much more significant to them. So that's why the Byzantines aren't really dealing with the Slavs. And the Slavs take advantage of the fact that the Byzantines are distracted, and they start coming in greater numbers, start settling more heavily, and establish a de facto control over much of the Balkans. And again, here I'm going to make reference to John Fine's book, and this time we'll be quoting the 6th century Byzantine historian John of Ephesus. John of Ephesus writes, quote, 3 years after the death of Justinian II under Tiberius, that's roughly 581, the cursed nation of Slavs campaigned. They overran all of Hellas, the provinces of Thessaly and all of Thrace, taking many towns and castles, laying waste, burning, pillaging, and seizing the country. They dwelt there in full liberty and without fear, as if it belonged to them. This went on for 4 years, and until the present, because the emperor was involved with the Persian wars and the armies were in the east. He goes on to explain that, quote, the Slavs had a free hand to do what they wanted, expanding where they would in the Balkans and treating land like a conquered province all the way up to the outer walls of Constantinople. And today, they are still established and installed in these Roman provinces, killing, burning, and pillaging, having learned to make war better than the Romans. So we can see here, even by the Roman Byzantine sources, they had lost control of the Balkans to the Slavs. Now we do see a break here where the Byzantines managed to, at least for a short period of time, focus their energy on the Balkans. This is due to the fact that around the year 591, the Byzantines and the Persians reach a peace deal. So there's a short period of time there where the Byzantines, after 591, where the Byzantines managed to refocus their efforts on the Balkans and make some military incursions into that region to push the Slavs out. Now, this isn't really successful. Although the Romans do manage to have some military successes against the Slavic tribes, manage to push some of the more significant Slavic military forces back across the Danube, this really has no effect on the demographics of the Balkan. They're not really ethnically cleansing the area, if you will, of these Slavic settlements. So the Slavic farming communities, the Slavic settlements, like I said, they're pretty much untouched by these Roman military efforts. They're still there, and therefore the demographics of the Balkans remains unchanged during this Roman reconquest of the Balkans. Now, just as and maybe this would have been successful, however, the Romans again find themselves at war with the Persians. I think about 10 years later, after this peace deal reached in 591, the Persians re-engage the Byzantine armies to the east, and at the beginning of the 7th century, the Romans again find themselves at war with the Persians. The Slavs take advantage of this fact that the Romans are distracted once again on the eastern portions of the empire, and now you see even greater Slavic incursions into the Balkans from north of the Danube. We see very, very, very heavy settlements in starting in this early 7th century period, primarily in modern Serbia, Macedonia, Bulgaria. This is where you see the most heavy Slavic concentration, but they also go into parts of Greece, which we'll get into in the next episode. But again, very heavy Slavic incursions. One Roman historian actually states that in a single raid, a single Slavic raid into the region of Thrace, there were over 100,000 Slavs. So you're seeing these single raids containing over 100,000 Slavic raiders. So we are dealing with unprecedented numbers of barbarians moving into the Balkans, and again, the Romans are too distracted to deal with this, and the Slavs again have de facto control over this region. The cities, whereas previously during the Gothic raids, the cities such as Skopje, Sofia, Belgrade, again, those are modern names of those Roman cities, but we saw previously that those fortified cities managed to withstand Roman attacks. This managed to withstand Gothic attacks. This is not the case with these massive Slavic invasions. All those cities fall. They fall to the Slavs. The only two cities that really hold out as far as the Romans are concerned are Thessaloniki and Constantinople. Every other city is basically conquered by these Slavic invaders. And the indigenous population is further devastated. Like I said in the previous video, the Gothic raids managed to significantly depopulate the Balkans. However, some of these original peoples, Thracians, Illyrians, and so forth, did remain. A lot of them did flee, like I said, to the mountains or to Constantinople and Thessaloniki. But there were still some that remained in the area. But with this Slavic invasion, they are completely devastated and depopulated. The indigenous population does not manage to hold out against these Slavic raids. And I'm actually going to once again quote here from John Fine, as he has a couple excellent passages here regarding what happened to the indigenous population. So, quote, "What was the fate of the indigenous population? Many were killed, while others were carried off beyond the Danube as captives, some of whom were ransomed and returned, or fled to walled cities or to the islands. Still others withdrew to the mountains or remote regions, and their descendants reappeared later as Vlachs or Albanians, who begin to turn up in the written sources in the 11th and 12th centuries. The Thracians disappear from history." So we can see here that the few Romans who remained in the region fled to the mountains, and they would become the modern Vlachs. The Vlachs today speak a Romance language, a Latin language, and this is because they are the descendants of the of the small number of Romans who remained in the Balkans. So that's the first initial waves of Slavs into the Balkans, into the interior. In the next video, I will be discussing how the Slavs come in subsequent waves, even larger waves, if you can believe it, and manage to push all the way into the heart of Greece, all the way down to Corinth, and devastate the Greek portions of the Balkans. So, until then, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.